turn off his heat tonight. I did not care what the temperature does. That was the order the president of our Homeowners Association gave at 9:40 on a February night, with a blizzard pushing over the mountains and the forecast calling for 22 below zero before sunrise. By 2 in the morning, ice had formed along the inside edges of my bedroom windows. The copper lines behind the walls were knocking like somebody trapped in there was trying to get out, and my dog Copper had crawled under the blankets and pressed his whole trembling body against my legs. They shut down my heat over $18,700 in fines I did not owe, for rules that did not exist, under authority they had never possessed. The funny part was, every house in that neighborhood was warm because of me. Every boiler, every circulation pump, every underground main carrying hot water beneath those manicured driveways. I had designed it, installed it, and still legally owned it. Denise Harrow just had not bothered to learn that before she tried to freeze me out of my own home. My name is Nolan Mercer, and I live outside Laramie, Wyoming, high enough in the snowy range that winter does not really arrive. It settles in and starts making demands. The neighborhood was called Silver Crown Preserve. 48 custom homes scattered across a private ridge, all stone fireplaces, heated garages, wine rooms, and windows tall enough to display the weather like a painting. My place looked like it had wandered in from a different story. 2 bedrooms, cedar siding faded by 12 winters, a narrow porch, and a metal roof I had installed with my brother over one long weekend and 3 cases of cheap beer. I built most of it myself after the development company ran out of money. And I stayed because my wife Elise loved the place. She used to say the wind sounded different up there, less like weather and more like the mountain thinking out loud. Elise died 5 years before all this started. A brain aneurysm so sudden that I left the house one morning with a wife and came home that night with a casserole from a neighbor, and a silence I still do not know how to describe. Copper was her dog, technically, a red heeler with one white ear and the emotional sensitivity of a retired detective. He still slept on her side of the bed, and I never had the heart to move him. About 30 yards from my house stood a low concrete building with dark green metal siding and no windows. Most residents assumed to belong to the HOA. Some thought it was a pump house. One woman told a guest it was probably a storage shed for road salt. Inside were 4 high-efficiency boilers, 8 variable speed pumps, a backup generator, a chemical treatment system, and nearly 7 miles of insulated supply and return piping buried beneath Silver Crown. That building was the heart of the ridge. Without it, those 48 luxury homes were just expensive refrigerators with granite countertops. 14 years earlier, a developer named Preston Vale had hired me to design the central hydronic heating system for the entire project. I was a licensed mechanical contractor then, still young enough to work 16 hours and call it ambition instead of poor judgment. Vale wanted something impressive he could put in the brochures: district heating, energy efficiency, radiant floors in every room, hot water on demand, the whole mountain living without sacrifice pitch. I drew the original plans at Elise's kitchen table. She kept sliding coffee toward me and correcting my spelling on the presentation notes. The system took 18 months to build. I supervised every trench, pressure tested every loop, and personally welded the main headers because I did not trust anyone else with them. Then Vale's financing collapsed halfway through phase 2. He owed my company just over $600,000. There was no cash left, so the bankruptcy trustee offered me the heating plant, the land under it, and the entire buried distribution network as settlement for my mechanic's lien. My lawyer at the time called it an unusual deal. Elise called it getting paid in pipes. I took it. The transfer was signed, notarized, recorded, and placed in a fireproof box in my basement, where it sat untouched for more than a decade because nobody questioned it. The homes kept getting heat. The residents paid utility assessments to the HOA, and I maintained the system under a service agreement so old most people on the board had never read it. Then Denise Harrow became president. Denise had the kind of confidence you usually only see in people who have never been told no by anyone they considered important. She wore white ski jackets that somehow never got dirty, drove a silver Mercedes SUV with the plate Madam P, and spoke to contractors like she was deciding whether to buy them. Her husband, Curtis, was a financial advisor who wore loafers in snow and smiled with only the top half of his face. Together they had run Silver Crown for 7 years. Denise controlled the board, Curtis controlled the budget, and the other 3 members controlled absolutely nothing. My trouble with her began over a porch light. Not noise, not safety, Not some ugly floodlight aimed at the neighbors, just a small amber fixture Elise had picked out when we built the house. Denise sent me a notice saying the bulb produced an unapproved color temperature that disrupted the visual unity of the community. I thought it was a joke. I checked the covenanters anyway, all 52 pages, and there was nothing about porch lights, bulb color, or visual unity. I wrote back politely and quoted the relevant sections. 3 days later, Denise appeared on my porch with Curtis standing half a step behind her, holding a leather folder against his chest. She looked at the light, then at me, as if one of us had disappointed her personally. The board has discretion in matters of appearance, she said. Not unlimited discretion, I told her. Her smile tightened. Mr. Mercer. People here have invested millions of dollars in their homes. Standards matter. I glanced past her toward the ridge, where steam curled from chimney vents and warm water moved beneath the road through pipes I owned. Then I looked back at her. Funny thing about standards, I said. They usually have to be written down. Curtis let out a little laugh, the kind meant to sound amused but landed closer to a warning. Denise stepped nearer. You may have been here before the rest of us, Nolan, but that does not make you special. She turned and walked back to the Mercedes, her boots barely leaving marks in the snow. That first notice was followed by 5 more. My firewood stack was visible from a secondary roadway. My mailbox post had weathered beyond acceptable uniformity. Copper's outdoor water bowl counted as an unauthorized yard accessory. My snow stakes were the wrong shade of orange. A pine tree near the driveway created what Denise called an asymmetrical entry corridor. The last notice cited my front door numbers because the metal finish was inconsistent with the neighborhood's architectural character. 6 fines in 11 weeks, totaling $18,700. I appealed everyone, with photographs, measurements, and direct quotes from the covenants. Every appeal came back denied with the same sentence. The board has reviewed the matter and affirms its decision. No explanation, no evidence, just 5 signatures. Then came the certified letter threatening a lien against my home. I read it at the kitchen table while Copper watched me from beside the stove. And for the first time, I stopped feeling irritated and started feeling curious. Bullies get careless when they think resistance is just noise. They repeat themselves. They leave patterns. And if you give them enough room, eventually they put the part they are not supposed to say into writing. 3 nights later, they did exactly that. The part they put in writing was not just a lien threat. It was the reason behind it. Denise called an emergency board meeting on a Thursday night and sent the notice less than 6 hours before it started, probably hoping most people would miss it. I almost did. A neighbor named Walter Finch knocked on my door while I was eating reheated stew and handed me a printed copy of the email. Walter was 73, a retired pipe fitter with shoulders like an old barn and a hearing aid that whistled whenever he got excited. Denise had fined him $6,000 the year before because smoke from his fireplace was allegedly interfering with the mountain view. His wife had been in hospice at the time. He paid without fighting because, as he told me, grief already felt like a full-time job. The meeting agenda had one item: temporary suspension of utility privileges for delinquent residents. That phrase sat on the page like a loaded gun. Walter looked at me over the top of his glasses and said, "Nolan, I think she means you." I folded the notice, put on my coat, and drove to the clubhouse through snow that was coming down sideways. About 20 residents were there, most of them still wearing boots and winter hats. Denise stood behind the podium in a white sweater, Curtis beside her with the laptop open and a legal pad arranged square to the edge of the table. She explained that the board needed stronger enforcement tools against residents who refused to respect community standards. She never said my name at first. She called me a chronic violator, a hostile owner, and a threat to neighborhood harmony, which was impressive considering my social life mostly involved a dog and a hardware store cashier named Bev. Then Curtis introduced a motion allowing the HOA to restrict non-essential shared services until outstanding fines were paid. I raised my hand. Which services are non-essential when it is 20 below zero? Denise looked directly at me then, and there was something almost peaceful in her expression, the calm of a person who had already convinced herself that cruelty was administration. Heating is a community benefit, she said, not an individual entitlement. I felt the room shift. Even people who had avoided looking at me turned toward the podium. Curtis leaned into his microphone and added that enforcement would be applied carefully and only after proper notice. I asked him to point to the provision in the covenanters authorizing the board to cut heat. He said the board possessed broad discretionary authority. I asked him for the section number. He told me not to turn the meeting into a courtroom. That was the moment I knew they had nothing. People with legal authority usually show it to you. People without it tell you to stop asking. The motion passed 4-1. The only opposing vote came from a pediatric surgeon named Mary Ann Cole, who asked Denise whether the board had consulted the county, a utility regulator, or an attorney specializing in essential services. Denise dismissed the question and moved on. After the meeting, Curtis caught me near the coat rack. He lowered his voice and said, "You can end this tonight. Pay the fines, repaint the house, replace the light, and stop challenging my wife in public." There was the real motive. Not architectural standards, not property values, humiliation. Denise did not want compliance. She wanted surrender. I looked at Curtis and said, "You should find out who owns the heat before you threaten to take it away." He smiled like I had made a joke. "We already know who owns it. Nolan. The association does." I almost corrected him, but something in me said not yet. Let them keep walking. At 9:40 that night, Denise called the maintenance contractor and ordered my service valve closed. By 2 in the morning, my house was 36 degrees. I lit the wood stove, opened the cabinet doors beneath the sinks, and set every faucet to a thin stream. Copper stayed wrapped in one of Elise's old quilts while I moved room to room checking pipe temperatures with an infrared thermometer. Around 3:30, I heard a sharp pop behind the laundry wall and my stomach dropped, but it was only a framing nail contracting in the cold. I did not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with coffee going bitter in the cup and listened to the house complain. Anger came first, hot and simple, but underneath it was something heavier. This was Elise's home. She had chosen the porch light they mocked, planted the pine tree they wanted removed, painted the front door with her own hands. Denise was not just trying to collect money. She was trying to erase every piece of this place that did not reflect her taste or obey her control. At sunrise, I called Walter. "They cut it," I said. He went silent, then muttered something about Denise that I will not repeat because YouTube has rules. By 8, he was at my house with 2 electric heaters and a thermos the size of a fire extinguisher. We stabilized the indoor temperature around 45, enough to protect the pipes. Then I drove to the county recorder's office. I asked for every document connected to the heating plant parcel, the original development, the bankruptcy transfer, and the Silver Crown HOA. A clerk named Janice spent almost an hour pulling records. She had silver hair, red glasses, and the patient expression of a woman who had watched wealthy people misunderstand deeds for 30 years. When she found the transfer to me, she tapped it with one fingernail and said, "Well, this seems important." The legal description covered the plant, the access road, the utility easements, and all distribution infrastructure installed under the original mechanical plan. There was no later conveyance to the HOA, no sale, no assignment, no easement transfer, nothing. I asked for certified copies. Janice printed them, stamped them, and slid them across the counter. Then she said, "You may want to read the service agreement filed with the bankruptcy order." I had a copy in my basement, but I had never studied it after the first few years. Back then, the board paid on time, and nobody treated heat like a weapon. I went home, opened the fireproof box, and found the agreement behind Elise's life insurance papers. It was 20 pages long, full of definitions, indemnity language, and maintenance schedules. Walter sat across from me while I read. Halfway through, I found the payment clause. The HOA owed the system owner $38,000 a year for maintenance, inspection, fuel management, and emergency service, adjusted every 3 years for inflation. The payment stopped 7 years earlier, the same year Denise became president. I checked my business account, then the paper invoices I had kept, because Elise used to say throwing away receipts was just gambling with memory. The unpaid balance, before interest, was $266,000. Walter gave a low whistle. Then I found Section 16, Paragraph 4. If the association interrupted service to any connected property without a court order, a documented safety emergency, or the written consent of the infrastructure owner, the owner could suspend service to the entire network after 72 hours notice. I read it twice. Walter asked what it meant. "It means Denise just gave me the right to turn off every boiler on this mountain." The words sounded dangerous even in my own kitchen. Walter leaned back slowly. "You going to do it?" I looked toward Copper sleeping beside the stove, his nose tucked beneath his tail. I thought about 48 homes, children, elderly residents, families who had nothing to do with Denise's obsession. No, I said, not until everyone has a chance to avoid it. The first lawyer I called told me the situation was too complicated. The second said an HOA could probably claim implied ownership through long use, which was nonsense, but expensive nonsense. The third was Lydia Shaw, a contracts attorney in Cheyenne who had spent 12 years representing utility cooperatives before opening her own practice. She listened without interrupting, then asked me to email every document. 40 minutes later, she called back and said, "Nolan, do not touch a valve until I get there, and do not speak to Curtis without recording it." Lydia arrived the next morning in an old green Subaru covered in road salt. She was small, sharp-eyed, and wore cowboy boots under a navy suit. She spread the records across my kitchen table. "Read the ownership transfer, the service agreement, the board minutes, and the notice authorizing the heat cutoff." Then she looked up and smiled. Not a happy smile. More like a carpenter who had just found the exact tool needed. "They interrupted service without a court order," she said. "They owe you 7 years of fees. They have no title to the infrastructure," and their attorney put the violation in writing. I asked whether I could legally suspend the system. Lydia pointed at the clause. "You can, after 72 hours, written notice. But legal does not always mean wise, and wise does not always mean painless. We need to give the residents time, notify emergency services, and make sure the board cannot accuse you of creating an undisclosed hazard." We spent the afternoon building a plan. First, demand immediate restoration of my heat and rescission of every fabricated fine. Second, demand payment of the overdue maintenance balance with contractual interest. Third, record updated ownership affidavits with the county. Fourth, issue the 72-hour suspension notice to the HOA, every homeowner, the county fire marshal, and the sheriff. Lydia also insisted we inspect the plant before sending anything. So Walter and I ran pressure tests, checked relief valves, logged pump conditions, and photographed every control setting. The system was safe. The people running the HOA were the hazard. Before the letters went out, I visited the residents Denise had hurt. Walter gave me names. The Rivas family had paid $9,000 for leaving holiday lights up through the first week of January. A widow named June Pritchard had paid $4,500 because her grandson's wheelchair ramp was visible from the street. Marianne Cole had been fined $3,000 for parking overnight at the hospital during a snow emergency. Every story had the same shape: an invented rule, a closed appeal, a threat, then payment. Lydia requested the HOA financial records. Curtis refused. That refusal made her more interested, not less. On Monday morning, the notices went out by certified mail and email. Denise opened hers at 8:17. At 8:23, she forwarded it to Curtis with one sentence that would later become famous around Silver Crown. "He is bluffing, and even if he owns the building, he cannot own the heat." Curtis called me 10 minutes later. His voice was controlled but not calm. "If you interfere with community heating, we will seek an emergency injunction and sue you for every dollar of damage." I said, "Read section 16.4. He paused. Then he told me the agreement was outdated. I asked whether that was his professional opinion as HOA counsel or his personal opinion as the president's husband. The line went quiet. That afternoon, they filed for a restraining order. The hearing was scheduled for the next morning. Denise arrived at court in a cream coat, Curtis carrying 3 binders behind her. Lydia brought one folder. Judge Evelyn Hart asked Curtis for evidence that the HOA owned the heating infrastructure. He talked for 10 minutes about community reliance, expectations, assessments, and public interest. The judge listened, then asked again for a deed. Curtis opened the first binder, then the second. He whispered to Denise. She stared at me as if I had hidden the documents from them personally. Finally, Curtis admitted they had no recorded conveyance. Judge Hart denied the injunction. She said the HOA could not force a private owner to provide uncompensated service while simultaneously violating the contract governing that service. Outside the courthouse, Denise cornered me beside the steps. Her cheeks were bright red from cold and anger. "Drop the back fees," she said, "and we will erase your fines." I looked at her. "You froze my house and threatened to take it. You do not get to offer me my own rights as a settlement." Her eyes hardened. "These people will blame you when their homes go cold." Maybe, I said, but they will know who gave the order that started it. The 72-hour clock kept running, and the forecast showed the coldest night of the year moving straight toward us. With 36 hours left, Denise called every heating company from Laramie to Fort Collins, looking for somebody willing to bypass my plant or force open the controls. But contractors tend to become very cautious when you use the words private property, recorded deed, and pending litigation in the same sentence. The first technician drove up, looked at the county documents Lydia had posted on the steel door, and left without unloading a tool. The second company declined over the phone. By midnight, Denise was out of legitimate options, so Curtis tried an illegitimate one. My security alert went off at 11:47 while I was sitting beside the wood stove with copper asleep against my boot. The camera showed Curtis crossing the snow toward the plant in black coveralls, carrying bolt cutters and a pry bar. I watched him test the deadbolt, circle the building, then remove the screws from an intake panel and squeeze through the opening. For a man who charged people to manage their money, he had not invested much thought in indoor cameras. I called the sheriff and kept watching as he wandered between the boilers, searching for a control he did not understand. He finally reached the main panel and raised the pry bar just as Deputy Elena Ward entered through the door I had unlocked remotely. The beam of her flashlight caught him with the tool above his shoulder. Curtis froze. Deputy Ward looked at him, looked at the panel, then said, "Sir, I strongly recommend you put that down before your evening gets even more educational." He was arrested for trespass, attempted utility tampering, and possession of burglary tools. Denise arrived in slippers and a fur-lined robe while they were placing him in the patrol vehicle. She stood in the snow screaming that he was the HOA attorney, as though a law license were a backstage pass to somebody else's boiler room. By sunrise, half the neighborhood knew. By lunch, all of it did. The 72 hours expired at 6 that evening, but I did not simply kill the system and walk away. Lydia had arranged temporary warming shelters at the fire station and clubhouse annex. The county had emergency crews standing by, and every homeowner had received instructions to drain vulnerable lines, open cabinets, protect pets, and relocate elderly family members. 39 households signed a petition demanding Denise restore my service and negotiate. She refused. At 5:58, she emailed the board saying surrender would weaken future enforcement. That sentence settled it for me. This was never about safety, money, or community. It was about proving she could hurt one person badly enough to frighten 47 others. I entered the plant with Walter beside me and Copper watching from his heated bed near the wall. Outside, the temperature had fallen to 18 below, with wind pushing it closer to 35 below. I placed my hand on the first boiler casing. The metal vibrated beneath my palm, steady as a pulse. I thought about Elise bringing me coffee while I drew the plans, about the way she laughed when I told her the plant might outlive both of us. Then I shut down Boiler 1, Boiler 2, Boiler 3, and Boiler 4. The pumps slowed one at a time until the familiar hum faded into silence. Walter looked around the quiet room and whispered, "Never thought I would hear this place stop breathing." Neither did I. Within 3 hours, Silver Crown began cooling. By midnight, several homes were below 50 degrees. Some residents had prepared exactly as instructed and stayed safe. Others had believed Denise when she told them the shutdown would never happen. The first frozen pipe burst shortly after 2 in the morning, then another, then 6 more. By dawn, 29 houses had water damage ranging from cracked fittings to flooded basements. The total eventually reached nearly $1.6 million, but nobody blamed the cold alone. They had seen the letters, the court ruling, the safety instructions, and Denise's refusal to negotiate. At 9 that morning, the residents forced an emergency meeting in the clubhouse annex, where portable heaters rattled beneath folding tables and everybody wore coats indoors. Denise stood behind the podium and called my action sabotage. The room exploded. Marianne Cole demanded the board minutes. Walter demanded the financial records. June Pritchard rolled her wheelchair to the front and asked Denise why an accessibility ramp had cost her $4,500. Denise tried to regain control by striking the podium with her hand, but authority is a strange thing. Once people stop believing in it, all the pounding in the world cannot bring it back. Lydia and I presented the ownership transfer, the service contract, the unpaid invoices, the heat cutoff order, and the judge's ruling. Then a local accountant named Samuel Price stood up from the second row. He had volunteered to review the HOA books after Curtis's arrest. What he found ended Denise's presidency before the meeting was halfway over. More than $58,000 in fines had been routed through a so-called compliance account controlled only by Denise and Curtis. Thousands had paid for restaurant bills, ski resort memberships, salon appointments, and lease payments on the Mercedes with the Modem P plate. The silence that followed felt colder than the building. Deputy Ward entered from the rear with two investigators from the county attorney's office. Denise looked at Curtis's empty chair, then at the residents she had bullied for years, and for the first time I saw fear replace certainty. She was arrested for fraud, theft, and conspiracy. The residents voted to remove the entire board that same morning, 44-2. Apparently Denise and Curtis had two friends more loyal than intelligent. I restarted the plan at 4 that afternoon after the new emergency board signed a temporary agreement recognizing my ownership and restoring payment. One by one, the pilot flames caught behind the glass. Blue, clean, and steady, the pumps came alive. Warmth moved into the buried mains, and the mountain slowly began breathing again. 2 months later, the HOA's insurer paid me the overdue maintenance fees, interest, legal costs, and compensation for the illegal disconnection. Every fraudulent fine was refunded. Curtis lost his advisory license and pleaded guilty to attempted tampering and financial crimes. Denise received 18 months in county custody followed by probation, and a court order barred her from serving on any community association board in Wyoming. I used part of the settlement to establish a winter emergency fund for elderly and disabled residents across Albany County. Walter became its first volunteer inspector, mostly because retirement had failed to make him less bossy. On the first anniversary of the shutdown, we sat inside the plant drinking coffee while snow moved softly past the security lights. Copper slept beneath the control panel, one white ear twitching with every click of the relays. Walter raised his cup toward the boilers and said Elise would have been proud. I told him Elise would have made me wait 5 minutes longer just to make Denise sweat. He laughed so hard, coffee came out his nose. I still live in the same little house. The amber porch light is still there, and the pine tree Denise called asymmetrical now stands taller than the clubhouse roof. Some neighbors think I went too far by shutting down the system during dangerous cold. Others say the damage was the only thing powerful enough to break Denise's control. I have asked myself that question more times than I can count, because being legally right does not automatically make every consequence feel good. So tell me what you think. Did I protect my rights and finally stop a corrupt board? Or did innocent homeowners pay too high a price for a fight they did not start? Leave your answer in the comments. Share this story with anyone who has ever been bullied by an HOA. And subscribe, because the next president who tried to take a neighbor's property did not threaten a boiler plant. She bulldozed the only road leading to a volunteer fire station. And what happened when the wildfire came changed the entire county.